Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This is, I believe, my final episode in my series about haunted Scranton, Pennsylvania. I really didn't expect my Scranton trip and the research I did for my Scranton trip to end up yielding so much content, but really there's a lot to say about Scranton. This time I'm going to talk about a lot of interesting weird places, including a masonic temple, a courthouse, a haunted trolley in a trolley museum, and my favorite, a haunting that has to do with the film The Exorcist. I don't know how it happens that so many of the things I end up covering have connections to The Exorcist, but, its reach is wide-ranging, I guess. Like the last couple episodes, my main source for this episode is the book Haunted Scranton, After Dark in the Electric City by A.C. Bernardi. So if I don't mention a source for something, it's from that book. Otherwise, I'll mention the other sources that I used. And with that, let's get into it. Let's talk about a weird Masonic temple. So located at 420 Washington Avenue in Scranton, the Scranton Cultural Center at the Masonic Temple was first opened in 1930. It is a very grand neo-Gothic and Romanesque building. It was designed by the same person who designed Rockefeller Center in New York City, one Raymond Hood. So again, this is an example of Scranton having this past as a sort of world-class city. It's the same architect as Rockefeller Center, and it sounds like a really beautiful building. It's definitely worth Googling pictures of it. It is constructed from Indiana limestone, and it's adorned with carvings of dragons and Masonic symbols. The author of Haunted Scranton speculates that the limestone that the building is built out of might have something to do with its paranormal aspects. I've talked before about stone tape theory, which is this idea that hauntings can be caused by almost a recording that takes place when something happens. The idea is almost like the stone around something is a cassette tape that is getting recorded onto. I'm a little bit skeptical of this theory, and I've talked about that in the past, but I think it's interesting, and I always like to kind of make a mental note anytime someone's like, well, limestone is connected to hauntings, because now at least I'll have an eye out for limestone. And, I am curious if maybe it has some kind of connection to residual hauntings. We'll see. Anyway, to get back to the Cultural Center, this is a huge building. It's 180,000 square feet. It's 10 stories tall, but only 5 of those stories are accessible via elevator for some reason. It contains 2 theaters, several meeting halls, and a grand ballroom, in addition to a lot of other stuff. It also has a sub-basement that stretches 60 feet below the basement floor. And psychics and mediums who have walked around the building have claimed that there are secret chambers hidden in the walls, which is very cool. Some people seem to think that there are treasures or interesting relics hidden away in these secret rooms, which, is very cool if true. Though who knows? According to the website nepascene.com, which I'll be citing several times throughout this episode. Oh, and it's worth knowing that NEPA stands for Northeastern Pennsylvania. According to nepascene.com, multiple groups of paranormal investigators have observed strange phenomena in this area. So I wanted to read a bit from this article that is linked in the show notes. Several paranormal groups have also investigated the Scranton Cultural Center and have had unexplainable encounters. We were in one of the Mason rooms, and within maybe 5 to 6 minutes, the temperature dropped from 71 degrees to 65 degrees. And it was a big room, says Alicia Van Duzer, member of the Society for Paranormal Research and Investigation, SPRI. Van Duzer also spoke of an EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, her team was able to capture. We got a voice saying what we thought was, "Are you speaking for us, Tyler?" There was no one in our group or employee named Tyler. We found out later that Tyler is actually a Mason title, not a name. It is the person who sits outside the Mason meeting room and relays messages from the outside after a meeting has already started. So I think that's really interesting. I always find it a little bit more convincing when someone uncovers something paranormal that they just wouldn't have known otherwise. They find it out through paranormal means. And that's a really specific detail and feels like something that someone in that position might say. So very cool. So next, there have been stories of hauntings in one of the theaters in the building, the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Theater. So in this theater, there is a seat that is reserved for a ghost named Sarah. She's often seen sitting in a chair in a private balcony on the left side of the stage. I love this. It's very Phantom of the Opera. In terms of what we know about Sarah, she is a young white girl between 8 and 10 years old, and people think that she is some relative of a prominent Scranton area resident from the 1930s or 40s. There's not a specific resident who people think she might be related to, just somebody wealthy and well-known. They see her most often during performances when that part of the theater isn't being used by guests. But other staff and the cleaning crew have also glimpsed her after hours. People have also seen weird lights and shadows in the theater, and one person saw a faint bluish-white light glowing in the dark balcony. So then, also within the building, there is a room called the Casey Library. And since the 1960s, people have seen apparitions in this second-floor room. Sometimes people walk in to see a man dressed in a dark cloak with the hood pulled over his head sitting in one of the chairs in the library. Usually this happens when someone has just walked through the library and then they walk back through and there hadn't been anyone there before, but now this guy is just there. And apparently his clothes look sort of like a Masonic robe. He never seems to notice the person who's walked in, and then he just disappears. People don't seem to feel threatened by him, especially because he doesn't seem to observe the other people in the room. Though, folks tend to feel, understandably, a little freaked out. He sounds like an intimidating sort of figure to run into. And in terms of the history of the room, it used to be a quiet study room when it was used by the Masons. So that's the old Masonic temple. Oh, also it's worth noting that a few weeks before I went to Scranton, maybe it was even 1 week before I went to Scranton, there was a paranormal conference that was held at the Scranton Cultural Center at the Masonic Temple, and I was so sad that the timing just didn't quite work out for my visit, to align with that convention, because that would have been so fun to both, go into the building and also to meet some folks. So at any rate, it probably is worth noting that it's the sort of place that has hosted its fair share of paranormal events, in case that's relevant at all. Okay, so the next building I want to talk about is the Lackawanna County Jail. So this building was constructed in the 1880s. It was originally meant to hold 110 prisoners, but in 1999, they expanded it to hold 1,200 prisoners. The new part of the jail is built on top of an old burial site, and people have claimed that a former warden still patrols the area in ghostly form. There is also a story about a female guard who one night heard screaming coming from a nearby cell. So she went over and she expected to see a fight, but when she got there, she didn't see anything unusual. Instead, she saw a frightened female prisoner who was sitting in the corner of the cell, and the prisoner said that she had been sleeping and then awoke to see a man's face pressed up against the glass of the window on the door of her cell. He didn't say anything to her, but he stared at her really intensely and had a threatening vibe. Sure that he wanted to harm her, and afraid that he might get into the cell, the prisoner, of course, started screaming. Honestly, I can't think of much scarier than that, because as someone who's imprisoned in a jail, you're pretty helpless. And whether someone is a ghost or like a real person, the idea that this scary seeming dude has just like come in and is maybe ready to harass you that's really upsetting and scary. But of course, after hearing the story, the guard said that no one had gone in or out of that cell block all night, so it couldn't have been a real person. And of course, the guard hadn't seen anyone in the hallway when she was going there. So it seems that it was paranormal. And the prisoner did say that other female inmates had seen this ghostly man, and he was fairly well known in the jail. So that's just terrifying. All right, next let's talk about haunted car number 46 at the Scranton Trolley Museum. I'm really bummed that I didn't end up getting to go to the Trolley Museum because it sounds so cool. And of course has this awesome haunted trolley car. But oh well, maybe someday I'll go back to Scranton and I can visit this museum. Anyway, the museum is located inside a former machine shop for the Dixon Manufacturing Company, which made locomotives and stationary steam engines. At its height in the late 1890s, the Dixon Manufacturing Company had 1,200 employees, and they made about 100 locomotives every year, which they distributed nationwide. Nowadays, it is part of the Steamtown National Historic Site, which is at the old rail yard, and in 1999, they opened the Electric City Trolley Museum. Inside the museum, there's a trolley, car number 46, that is supposedly haunted. It's one of 22 similar cars that were built in 1907 by the St. Louis Car Company, and which ran on the Philadelphia and Western Railway. It's the last car that still exists from this generation of trolley cars, which ran on a third rail system between Upper Darby and Stratford, Pennsylvania. People believe that this car is haunted by a woman named Nancy. The story goes that she was very sick and she was riding the streetcar to her family's place in Philadelphia because it was like an inner city streetcar line. But she died in transit, unfortunately. And people say that because this was an emotionally difficult thing for her, both, dying, and the fact that she couldn't get back to Philly to see her family before she died, because of these reasons and the emotions attached, she still haunts the car. People have heard a woman's voice call her name while they were alone in the building. Employees have heard heavy doors slamming shut even after the museum was closed to the public. Mediums have claimed to see a woman sitting in the back of the car. Once, someone asked the spirit whether she was trapped in that car and wanted to leave, and they heard a disembodied sigh in the car. However, it's worth noting, researchers have not been able to prove Nancy's existence from historical documents that they have reviewed. But people have also encountered other paranormal things in the museum, of course. They've had similar experiences in the room next to the room that car 46 is in, near statues of an early 1900s coal miner and breaker boy. Supposedly, there is a male spirit who roams freely within the building, and the story goes that he was one of the original builders of car 46, though who knows. He likes to play tricks on people and surprise people, and has moved items around throughout the building, so that sounds like your kind of standard poltergeist type activity. Next up, we have the Colonnade. This is a fancy Victorian mansion that was built in the 1870s. Eventually, the house was sold, and in 1963, the building became the home of a funeral director who also ran his mortuary business out of the house for at least 10 years after that. And also at the same time, the second and third floors were used as efficiency apartments. Apparently, an efficiency apartment is like a studio apartment, but less nice. Honestly, it sounds like a New York City studio apartment. Just a real basic place where you can live with no bells and whistles. In 1979, the parlor had to be moved because of zoning issues. So then it was just used as a home and apartments. And then in 2006, the building was purchased and renovated, and now it is an event venue and a bed and breakfast. And as often happens, the renovations seemed to awaken something paranormal. So first, when they were taking pictures of the building to prepare for renovations, they were looking at the pictures afterwards and noticed that there was a boy in one of the pictures, even though they were very sure that there had not been a child around while they were taking the photos. The young boy was standing on a side porch looking right at the person taking the photograph. He had dark hair and seemed like he was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and he was dressed in white knickerbockers and white knee-high stockings, which are obviously very dated garments of clothing. So, they seem to think that he is someone from the past. Supposedly, his spirit likes to run around the building and jump up and down on the beds, and he has a special liking for the front bedroom on the south side of the house. A medium has since visited and said that they sensed the presence of a child. They didn't think that the child had died in the building, just that he had lived there for a while, and perhaps he returned to the building because he liked living there so much. So, friendly little ghost there. So now let's go to the courthouse square. So it's worth noting that there's one story about Courthouse Square about a November 1932 murder. A man named Joseph Kosh had just been released from a prison in Auburn, New York, and he met Victoria Smolinski, alias Marie King, a woman who owned a brothel in town. They seemed to get along at first, and they had Thanksgiving dinner together, but he wanted to spend the night, and she did not want him to. So the next morning, he came back to her place with a 15-inch long bread knife that he had stolen, and he stabbed her 20 times. Then he was arrested, and I guess really fought back, and then he tried to kill himself a bunch of times, and then he was executed. This is just a side note, but the detail about it being a bread knife is really confusing to me because I think of bread knives as being serrated. I wonder if used to they weren't, or if maybe that detail is just a little bit wrong. And in speaking of death in the area, it's also worth noting that there used to be a gallows in Courthouse Square as well, just behind the courthouse on Adams Avenue, where there's a memorial statue to John Mitchell nowadays. So then if we go into the courthouse, there are even more ghost stories. Many people have claimed to see ghosts in the courthouse. Those include overnight workers seeing lights turning on and off in locked rooms that no one was inside. The third floor office, which used to be a marriage license office, apparently is particularly haunted. People would hear footsteps in empty hallways, they would feel cold spots, and in the bell tower, sheriffs have said that they've seen moving shadows and they have felt like they're being watched. In the early 2000s, one janitor saw a lady in white in a dark hallway on the second floor. It's unclear who this woman in white is supposed to be, whether she's, some historical figure from the past who had been there or what. But all we know is that the worker who saw her said that he had just finished working and he was about to leave. Then he remembered that he had left some of his stuff on the second floor. Nobody else was around, but in that second floor hallway, he saw a, quote, white semi-transparent figure that appeared to be a woman floating toward him slowly. He was freaked out, but he didn't run. And as he stood there, the woman in white passed overhead and didn't seem to see him at all. Other workers have said that they've seen her and had similar experiences. And also, apparently, there's a transparent man and a ghost couple who have been seen on the first floor of the building as well. And then if we look at a building just across the street from the courthouse, there's another weird story. So the ground floor of this building is a Subway restaurant, and then the 2 floors above that are lawyers' offices. And some of the people who work there have claimed to see ghosts in the office. One lawyer said that he heard shuffling noises and footsteps in the hallway at night after everyone had gone. He got up to see if anyone was there, and of course, there wasn't anybody. And that happened so often that he just got used to it whenever he was there late at night. Some workers also said that they have experienced cold spots and they've heard keys jingling even though no one was around. And the author of Haunted Scranton suggests that this maybe was some sort of ghostly janitor. Oh, also, I guess I said that office workers there have claimed to see ghosts. I really misspoke. They've claimed to encounter weird paranormal stuff there. All right, on to my favorite of the Scranton hauntings. Let's talk about the bust of Jason Miller. In case you're not familiar with him, Jason Miller was a playwright and an actor, and he just so happened to play Father Karras in The Exorcist. He was from Scranton, and he moved back there when he was older, and he died there in 2001 when he was in his 60s. And now there is a bust of him in Scranton, but this isn't just any bust. I wanted to read a tiny bit from the website oddestthingsiveseen.com describing this bust. Far from merely being honored with a random hometown boy turned marginally notable bust tucked away in the lobby of some local theater due to the earnest efforts of some minor lobbying group, coinciding with the whims of some local politician, Miller was the entire inspiration behind the recent creation of the Piazza dell'Arte, a courtyard-like monument directly beneath the Spruce Street side of the looming tower of the Lackawanna Courthouse. This bust is hollow, and supposedly it contains Miller's ashes. I'm not totally sure how true that is. Wikipedia says that Miller's ashes appeared on set during a 2011 Broadway revival of That Champion Season, a play that Miller wrote, which was set in Scranton, whereas the bust was built in 2008, several years before that. So I'm not exactly sure where his ashes are now, or if maybe they were divided, so some of them were in the bust and some of them were elsewhere, but that's what they say about his ashes at least. Now, the bust was sculpted by Miller's close friend, Paul Sorvino. And if his name is familiar, that's because he was an actor who was in a bunch of things, but probably most notably, he was Paul Cicero in Goodfellas. But in addition to being a talented actor, he was also a very skilled cast bronze sculptor. Who would have guessed? That seems like the most random thing ever, but, you know, it's really nice that he was able to create this bust to memorialize his friend. There's a really interesting article in nepascene.com that talks about the amount of effort and attention that Sorvino put into the sculpture, which I think is relevant from a paranormal point of view, so I do want to read a bit from that article. As a professional sculptor, Sorvino was asked by the city to create a bronze bust of his longtime friend, unveiled in December of 2008. It took him a year to capture his friend as he remembered him, giving it 3 separate tries and countless hours of studying his pictures and pausing his films. Any competent sculptor can make something look reasonably like the subject. The question is, when is it going to be born? When is it going to have life? I must have worked on those eyes for a month alone, Sorvino said. He said that he wanted the statue to be Miller, not just resemble him, and as much as the bust overlooking Courthouse Square encompasses Miller's passion for the city, it also represents the passion of its sculptor. It was almost a mission for my dear, dear departed friend and for all those people who wanted this in Scranton. In a way, it's my love letter to him, but it allows me to let Jason keep giving his love back to them. He loved Scranton very, very, very much. It was the only place he felt home, Sorvino continued. I'm very happy that I got the chance, the opportunity to express that to the town, which I love, and to my dear friend who I loved. Even today, it still brings him back to that one fateful meeting, that one singular haunted look over 4 decades ago. The face on the statue, if you look directly into his eyes, is almost exactly the impression of the face that I saw the first time I laid eyes on him. So I probably don't need to explain why I find this part of this article so interesting and so amazing. You know, when you hear about supposedly haunted statues, they aren't usually made by a close friend of the person they're commemorating. And you can just tell how much attention and care Sorvino put into this work. And it's just so interesting to me that he was like, no, I don't want this to just represent my friend. I don't want this to just look like my friend. I want this to be my friend. And I want this to replicate him in a very particular point in time. Like the fact that he was like, no, I want his eyes to look just like how they looked when I first met him. Like I want to capture him in this particular point in time and in this particular memory of him. Like, I don't know if a person can create a haunting. My general opinion is like, yeah, I feel like if you do put enough like intention and care and concentration into something, it feels like something could come of it. Like there could be some sort of haunting or whatever you want to call it. Something could come out of that. But this, combined with the fact that maybe some of his ashes are in there, combined with the fact that Jason Miller loved Scranton so much, and like, you know, as an actor, he was well known for The Exorcist, you know, a very haunted movie, but really he was well known for this play that he had written that was set in Scranton. And it seems like just Jason Miller had so much love for Scranton, and it feels almost like Jason Miller would have been really happy to haunt Scranton. And like, I don't know, there's just something so interesting about this statue or like this bust being a stand-in for Jason Miller, and for the sculptor to have put so much of himself into it, and also to be like, no, this sculpture is a stand-in for this person. He loved this city. This is his city. Look, this is him. Like, I don't know. Now I'm really interested in the idea of haunted sculptures, and I'm very curious what the sculptor's intent can do to something like this, especially something memorializing someone who's deceased. I don't know. Now this just makes me want to go down a whole rabbit hole about like haunted paintings and haunted sculptures, so maybe that'll have to be a topic for another day. I haven't done research about this, but I feel like there's something there, and I find it so interesting. So if you do know any stories about haunted sculptures, haunted paintings, haunted art in general, in particular stuff that's memorializing a dead person, my email is buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. I want to hear these stories. But to get back to the Jason Miller bust, in addition to everything that I just said, it's also worth noting that the sculpture is located really close to an apartment building where Miller had lived for a bit. So like not only was Scranton important to him, but like he literally lived in that part of Scranton for a time. And, you know, the bust has been mentioned in multiple things. So there's an article from the Times-Tribune, which is a newspaper in Scranton, from July 2010. And the article is called Ghost Walk Tours Highlight Scranton's Weird Grisly History. And I just wanted to read a tiny bit about a ghost tour stopping there. They also stopped at the bust of actor/playwright Jason Miller, a Scranton native who died at Farley's Bar, May 13th, 2001. Mr. J told the group that some people swear that they can hear the bust whisper, "The power of Christ compels you," Mr. Miller's famous line from The Exorcist. Several of the people on the tour took turns leaning close to the sculpture, but no one reported hearing anything. All this being said, I do tend to think that anything associated with The Exorcist gets tied in with stories of hauntings. See my episodes about Fordham University for more info about that. But still, I don't think that means that the bust isn't haunted. Maybe the weirdness surrounding The Exorcist really stretches far enough to cause distant hauntings, kind of just anywhere that's been touched by anyone who's touched The Exorcist. I don't know. It's just really interesting for a movie to have so many disparate hauntings all connected to it. I assume that's because of the cultural impact and sort of the historic nature of The Exorcist, but I'm definitely curious if there's other horror movies that have a similar level of hauntings associated with it. There isn't one to my knowledge, but maybe I'm just not thinking of something. Next up, we have Andy Galvin's Eatery and Pub. So this is a really beautiful Victorian-looking house that has 3 stories and a tower, and it was built sometime between 1887 and 1890. And apparently it's also right across the street from the Lackawanna County Jail. Since the 1980s, people have reported that there have been ghosts at this location. A previous owner said that he encountered some weirdness while he was renovating rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors, turning them into apartments to rent out. A lot of this is kind of garden variety haunting stuff, so you know the drill. It was a really hot day, and he was painting a room, and then suddenly he felt very cold air blowing on him. He said it was as if he had walked into a freezer. But he couldn't figure out what was going on, and he couldn't find a source for the cold air, so he looked around to see if someone could be playing a prank on him somehow. It's unclear to me if this house had central air, but I would be kind of surprised if it did because of its age. But, you know, of course, after he looked around, he still didn't see anybody. So he went back to work, and then the chill eventually went away. But of course, after a little bit, it came back. And this time, in addition to the cold air, he heard a man's voice very close to his right ear. He couldn't understand what the man was saying, but the voice sounded gruff. And so then he ran out of the house, and he never went alone to the 2nd or 3rd floors of the building again. He ended up selling the building in 1988. So then after that, the current owner bought it, and one night the owner's son and some of his friends were having a party, and you guessed it, they played with a Ouija board, and they wanted to try to communicate with whatever ghost lived in the house. When they asked the ghost what his name was, the board spelled out George. Through further Ouija board sessions, they learned that George was supposedly a coal miner who lived there in the late 19th century, who, again, supposedly killed himself in one of the top floors of the building. As they continued communicating with George through the Ouija board, things got scarier. And after a while, it sounds like they were getting a bad enough vibe from George that they stopped using the Ouija board entirely. And of course, when the owner's son asked a priest what he should do with the board, because he was very freaked out, the priest blessed the board and then he told him to burn it. So then he burned the board. Supposedly, the owner has enlisted the help of several priests to try to rid the building of any spirits that are still there, but it sounds like George is still hanging out. But employees seem to find him pretty harmless. I guess he's just more mischievous than anything, so again, kind of some poltergeist vibes here. You know, it's the usual. There's a stack of chairs, and then suddenly the chairs are no longer stacked. Tables are moved. The jukebox turns on and off. Silverware jumps off the tables all by itself. There have also been reports of an apparition, and supposedly people feel uncomfortable in the restroom, and they get the sense that they are being watched. Which, out of all the places where you don't want to feel like you're being watched, I feel like the restroom is high on that list, you know? Some people have said that the door of the bathroom stall has closed itself and latched itself on its own, which is, again, really not something that you want. And also the toilet flushes by itself. I am assuming this is not an automatically flushing toilet, right? I'm assuming it's a normal one. People who have rented the apartment on the second floor have claimed to experience cold spots, and they've said that their furniture has been moved around. So then next, let's look at West Mountain Sanitarium. This info comes from nepascene.com as well. So this sanitarium was originally called the Lackawanna County Tuberculosis Hospital. It opened in 1903, and it sounds like it was kind of like ahead of its time, had a lot of impressive treatments, and eventually the hospital followed the pattern of everything else in Scranton, and it closed in 1971, and now I guess it's just like abandoned. The article that I read was from 2014, so I assume it's still standing, but I guess I'm not 100% sure. But the story goes that folks who have died in the hospital are still hanging around and haunting the area. There have also been cases of arson and, plenty of the usual graffiti and stuff because, bored teenagers are always going to find abandoned buildings. But it's also been a place that paranormal investigators have gone and have gotten some EVPs and some interesting things in their photographs. So NEPA Paranormal talked to this website about their experiences, so I wanted to read a little bit of this article. As they were investigating a basement within the men's quarters, one investigator had asked, "How did you die?" As the question was asked, the team was able to smell smoke. They looked out and witnessed smoke billowing into the room and could see flames directly behind it. They ran as fast as they could to the main path of the sanitarium. Once they turned around to comprehend what they had witnessed, the fire was gone. Katie Christopher, case manager and co-founder of NEPA Paranormal, states, "We could still feel the smoke in our lungs, even though there was no smoke to be seen." So, very interesting. I found an archived page from NEPA Paranormal that was, archived on the Wayback Machine that includes some EVPs and photographs from the investigation. So I'll include that in the show notes if you want more info on that. I don't think I saw anything in the pictures of apparitions and stuff, but, maybe you'll see something when you look at it. I know that kind of thing is sort of hit or miss. So now let's go to the judge and jury bar. So this is something that I found in that article from 2010 in the Times Tribune, kind of going through the path of a ghost tour and talking about some of the sites. Apparently, the bar was once the site of the Imperial Underwear Company, and on January 17th, 1908, there was a fire, and some things never change. There weren't proper worker safety precautions, the fire escapes were bad, and dozens of people died there. So supposedly that is haunted, though the article doesn't go into a ton of detail about what the haunting is supposed to be. But, we can probably guess, right, based on the story. And then the last place I wanted to touch on really quickly is the Lackawanna Mine. So this is an old mine in Scranton's McDade Park. It's right next to the Anthracite Museum, and you can actually go down into it and take a tour. I had actually planned to go on a mine tour my first day in Scranton, but as I mentioned in the first episode in this series, I was coming straight from the airport and I had my backpack and they didn't allow backpacks at the mine for the tour. So I couldn't go on the tour. And to be honest, that was probably for the best because I was not in great shape after the flight. And I would say there was a non-zero chance that I might have had a panic attack because you are like, I don't know, 250, 300 feet underground in the dark. And the tour is like an hour, but TripAdvisor says it actually lasts for 90 minutes. And it's supposed to be an amazing tour, but, I say there's a non-zero chance I would have had a panic attack underground for 90 minutes in that state. Honestly, probably there's like a 70% chance I would have, so it's probably best that I didn't go. But it's supposed to be an amazing destination when you visit Scranton, and people really like the tour. And unsurprisingly, since of course coal mining was incredibly dangerous, there are stories about the mine being haunted. The website ghostsoldiers.tv claims that the mine has some ghostly activity. They claim that they captured EVPs and they got a photograph that included an orb. I find orbs very, what's the word I'm looking for? Trying to think of a nice way to say it. Very unconvincing because a lot of the time it's just like dust in front of your camera's lens or like a bug or something. But they also got EVPs. I'll include a link in the show notes where you can read their full report and listen to the EVPs if you're interested. But while I may not be 100% convinced by the evidence they collected, I totally think that this mine is probably haunted. How could it not be, right? Like, even if no one died in this particular mine, coal mining was dangerous, difficult work, and I don't know, there's just something about being so far underground and being there for hours and working down there that, I don't know, I imagine that would put you in a pretty bad headspace, so I can't imagine that this mine wouldn't have some bad vibes. So with that, that's all the places I wanted to talk about in Scranton. I only had 4 episodes worth of content about Scranton. So, I feel like you don't hear about Scranton as like an unusually haunted place, probably because you don't hear about Scranton much at all, for the reasons I've enumerated in the prior episodes in this series. But I don't know, it's a really interesting place. It has a fascinating history. It has so many stories of cool hauntings, and I'm really glad I went. I'm really glad I did a little bit of research about it because it's just such an interesting place. If you want to learn more, you should definitely check out the book Haunted Scranton. I know I used a lot of information from that book, but it definitely goes into way, way more detail than I did here. So that's the place to go for, I'd say, the most comprehensive look at Scranton hauntings. And if you are from Scranton or you've been to Scranton and you have any ghost stories, I would love to hear them. Whenever I do stories about sort of lesser known haunted places, I feel like I get a lot of local people who write in and have stuff to say. So please write to me at buriedcircuitspodcast@gmail.com. In terms of next time, I'm trying to decide what I want to talk about in the next episode. I've been saying for like a year and change, that I want to talk about some weirdness that I encountered in the woods of North Carolina last year. I spent a lot of 2020 in North Carolina and spent a lot of times hiking in the woods because that is a thing that I enjoy doing. And, I don't get enough of a chance to do that here in New York City. And last October, so October 2021, I finally made it to a hidden cemetery in the woods in North Carolina and encountered some weirdness. And it wasn't even really like the weirdness I thought I was gonna run into. The cemetery is well known to local paranormal investigators and is supposedly a really good place to get EVPs and stuff. I don't think I got any EVPs there, though I definitely sometimes have trouble discerning EVPs when I listen back to my audio. But I did a solo Estes session and had some interesting stuff come out of that. And also I met someone in the woods who definitely had some creepy stuff to tell me. Not necessarily paranormal stuff, but definitely creepy stuff that, added a little something to my solo hike through some creepy autumnal woods, right? So I might talk about that next time. Probably I'll talk about that next time. As well as just the history of some of these weird hidden cemeteries that are just like in random state parks in this one part of North Carolina. And after that, I'm trying to decide what I want to talk about next. I definitely have some weird stories about hauntings in Denton, Texas that I want to talk about. I did a whole series a couple months ago about the Goatman's Bridge in Denton County, Texas, which is where I'm from. But while I was doing that series, I ran into so many other interesting stories of just bizarre stuff in that area. So I'll probably be talking about that sometime in the next month or two. But until then, you can check out the show notes for this episode with all of my sources and, kind of like my rough script at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram at buriedsecretspodcast. Oh, and also, I almost forgot to mention it. I am going to be starting a newsletter that I'm planning to send out on off weeks. So, I publish an episode every other week. So on those off weeks, I am planning to send out a newsletter. I kind of want to use it to share weird stuff that isn't right for an episode yet. Like maybe it's something that I've been researching or thinking about that I just haven't fleshed out into a full episode, or just stuff that I'm turning over in my head. But I would definitely say that the content will be different from what I'm talking about on the podcast. For example, I've written the first issue, which I'll send out a week from the day that this is published. So I think that's December 9th. And I am going to talk about liminality and vampires because I just recently read these 2 novels about vampires, and it kind of explored vampires in a way that I hadn't seen as much before, and in a way that sort of depicts them as very vulnerable and existing in this really liminal place. And also, both of these books are about queer characters who are vampires and are written by queer authors. So I also am looking a little bit about queerness and vampirism and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the first issue. I have a lot of other things I want to talk about. So if that's interesting to you at all, you can sign up on my website, which again is buriedsecretspodcast.com. And just in the top navigation, you'll see a thing that says newsletter, and you click on that, you put in your email, and then you'll be on the list for my new free newsletter. And I would love to hear people's thoughts about it and about the things I'm talking about in the newsletter. So please subscribe to that. Let me know what you think. And I think now that's actually everything that I wanted to say. So thanks so much for listening.